Senior Vice President of Scientific Affairs and Policy at the American Seed Trade Association, for a discussion on innovations in climate-resilient seeds with our moderator, Maggie Lake.
Well, that was a fantastic way to kick off the afternoon and really reminded us the intersection that we're sitting at. And I was so struck by just the underlying statement, which is, I think, obvious to us all, but we need to produce more food. We need to produce more nutritious food. And Dr. Fowler talked about the innovation, and it really starts with the seed, right? So we're going to talk about that level and what needs to happen in order to get to the goals that we need. So thrilled to have you all to do that. Peter, let's start with you and talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the innovations that Dr. Fowler referenced, and where are we in terms of the marketplace for that? Just sort of set the stage for us, if you will.
So I think, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation for all of us because it really positioned where technology and innovation need to come from. Talking about Norman Borlaug and saying, that bought us 30 years. It's a really good indication of timelines in agriculture to improve genetics and to actually address some of the constraints we have in production takes a long time. And that's been one of the things that struck me in my career is that agriculture is so important, and at the farm gate for farmers to be more productive, to make every acre more productive. And so, for us, when it comes to innovation, the last 20 years, there's been a lot of great innovation in the seed business, but it really needs toolkits. And so when you think about gene editing and what we're doing, at Cibus is we're really using those genetic resources that Dr. Fowler is actually protecting and maintaining that diversity and bringing it back to crops. And so we fit in with plant breeding. So we intersect with plant breeders, and what we do in the technology standpoint and the innovation side is really intersect there with using genetic resources more efficiently. And so, things like producing disease-resistant crops, that uses less fungicide and still maintains yield. They're things that we've been able to learn because of the huge amount of information from genomics and a seeds basis that we can use what's already in the seed to allow it to become resistant to certain diseases. And so, that innovation side, I think we're at a point now where with the right policies in place, the right innovation, we can really move forward. I'm excited to see that. It just takes a long time, and we just need to be able to do it faster.
Which is where the urgency comes from when we're having this conversation. Tom, when we're talking about technological innovations, we're usually running at them. If someone says, there's an entire VC ecosystem looking for the next unicorn, someone who's solving one of the world's biggest problems, and we know food security is one of them. In this case, it's not been that straight line, though. There are public relation issues. Consumers are a big part of this. What are you finding, and have we gotten past the point where we're looking at this differently than the stigma of what was genetically modified? Sure. That's what in the consumer ecosystem we were used to hearing about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about there, and to build on some of what Peter said, we are at a time when we do understand a lot about how breeders have been able to improve crops over generations and how that fits in, and then we have the computational skills that we have today, and you tie that with something like gene editing, it gives us access to do a lot. But then you have to have policies that support it and for it to make differences in a meaningful time frame. I think an example is gene editing was discovered basically in the CRISPR form, was discovered in 2012, and there was a bit of a rush to get into it and how it could help to accelerate breeding. And then in 2018, the European Union decided that they weren't ready to follow the regulatory policies that most of the Americas and other parts of the world were following. They were going to take longer to look at it and consider it like GMO. Stop. Everything, a lot of investment became a lot harder to get because of one group of countries deciding that that was an issue, and that slows the investment. And because many crops are globally traded, so if they're globally traded, then it has an impact. Now the other thing is an awful lot of this technology has been applied, and I think Dr. Fowler talked about what opportunity crops. We really should talk about food and feed. So an awful lot of this technology is applied to feed, and feed's important. I like a steak, but food is what we eat directly, and food is where I think we get the most impact from a consumer. So we made a new kind of leafy green, a new kind of lettuce, and basically the idea was to create something that was a nutritious lettuce that was edible. So many of you like kale probably, but I find it pretty tough. So we wanted to find something that ate like a romaine.
It's basically saying kale's inedible. We did just have it for lunch, but go on.
You know what? You have to massage it even to eat it, right? So we wanted something that was make it easier for people to get that nutrition in a salad. So we created something by taking a mustard green, which tastes like wasabi, and got rid of that wasabi flavor. We gave that to consumers, and if we gave them a survey and asked them, "Do you want that?" we'd probably get 30% of people pretty skeptical. You hand them a salad, and they saw it as it's a salad, and everyone wanted to try it. In fact, they were excited about trying it, had really good feedback on it. And I think that's, there's a big opportunity to create acceptance by driving things that are in the consumer's space.
And that's your point about feed. There was a point when we were having the conversation that it was not tangible and that we were talking about it theoretically.
Cheaper meat is hard to associate with the technology.
Right, but this is different. And Fenley, I think a couple of things I heard Dr. Fowler say, really leaning into the nutrition. And let's remember the climate intersection that we're at. And resilience is so important. What is happening that can help on those two very, very critical fronts?
Sure. So I think, to pull back a bit, for the American Seed Trade Association, our members are involved in seed production and seed breeding A to Z, alfalfa to zucchini, everything in between. So for us, it's really important that technology and policy works for everyone, works for across the board, because we want to keep the food on the table and we want to bring that variety of food onto our table across the world. So I think when we talk about climate change, it's the tempo of that challenge to our farmers. It's getting faster and faster. The tempo is like a 1/8, right? And the way that the solution that our plant breeders is bringing, it's operating at a slower tempo. So the technology that we're putting together, like CRISPR and gene editing, is helping us to increase that tempo. So we're matching the tempo of the challenges. But I think the third thing that really needs to occur for our table, to keep the food on our table, to grow that food on the table, is global policies. The global policy tempo got to match up. And right now, as Tom has mentioned, the EU policy is slow. Our policy is slow. So how do we speed up this policy, right? So this is why we're at the Foreign Policy Forum. This is why we're at the UN. It's about how do governments step up that tempo of policy development. And so scientists can step up that tempo of solution development to the farmers. And I think that's where, for us, our members are really trying to figure out that intersection.
Why, Peter, is it so slow? Have we identified where the friction is? Is it because this conversation around or the pressures on government to move on regulation on so many fronts, this is just not get high profile enough? Is it because there's still concern scientifically? What's holding it back?
So I think there's a number of things, but what's interesting is that food security and food safety, there's a huge amount of regulation that's already there in place. And so what slowed a lot of it down was, in the past with GMOs, there was uncertainty about what the outcomes were going to be. And, as a scientist, I can tell you it's one of the safest things that's ever happened. Having said that, it was limited. In my mind, it was like using Windows 95 on a computer today. It was great in the 90s, but, and it's still used. But so the regulators really kept adding on additional regulatory barriers to GMO, and they were really concerned about what the next technologies were going to be. I've spent the last 20 years of my life talking to organisations around the world, and I'm encouraged to see that a lot of the harmonising of policy now is starting to take effect. But I think, what was really something that really I struggled with, to be honest, was, this technology you're doing in gene editing is just getting around regulatory. That's not the case. There's food regulatory and seeds and genetics managed globally very well with regulatory. So it goes back to what I originally said about, and Tom said too, is we interact with plant breeding. And so, one of the challenges the policies around the world is they were looking to Europe, for example. And so how do they manage their regulatory? And I think what's really exciting for us this year is the Parliament finally voted on a law that will come into effect at one stage that really addresses that issue. It just took a long time. The technology has to evolve.
So the entire global pace was dictated by the slowest actor.
Always. Yeah, especially when you think about commodities. Food is shipped around the world. And this is where ASTA has been so helpful with regards to foreign policy and the harmonising and getting out and educating people that what we do is indistinguishable from what occurs in nature and what happens in plant breeding programs. So the regulatory is already in place. So, let's make sure that we don't stifle innovation again, as like we did with GMOs, because the planet doesn't have time. We're talking about climate resilient crops. We have technology now that can look at drought tolerance. We have technology that can look at salt tolerance and heat tolerance. These are genetic systems we fully understand. It's just a matter of getting into the crops that make sense. Some of these opportunity crops.
It's amazing. There are so many parallels because you'll hear the same thing from technologists, right? That sort of educating government officials and regulators who have the best intentions on what's happening because there's the speed of change is so fast has been a challenge across the board. So this is something that can be holistically addressed, and why we talk at the intersection of all of these subjects. Tom, I would imagine data and the availability of data and AI and all that we can harness when it comes to sort of that educating process, whether you're talking about regulators or you're talking about consumers, must be helping. I mean, talk to me a little bit about what Pairwise does and how you are addressing this.
Okay, I think food is really important, right? So I think I'm going to answer a little bit of the question you asked to Peter, and then I'll come back to this.
Sure.
So I think, people are right to worry about food and changes of food. It's really important. We need more food for more people, and if you've got enough food, then do you really want people changing the way your food is grown? So it's natural that people have some resistance, especially when there's a lot of people who are preaching challenges about it. Now, some of the GMO crops have more data on those products than anything that's ever been made, and yet people are still worried about that. So data plays a role, but I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. I think there's much more of an emotional attachment to food, which again is why it comes back to creating products that people interact with directly as a way to educate why it matters. I think there's a bunch of things that breeders have done that took them, say, 60 years to do. So like breeding blueberries so that I can eat blueberries now every day, and I used to get them, maybe one day in August or something like that, or a frozen one in a pancake. I can have fresh blueberries every day because breeders created varieties that could be grown in different climates, and we can have really good blueberries. If I told you that was from GMO or from gene editing, you'd probably be positive about the technology. And we're using gene editing to do the same sort of thing with some of the other fruits that are currently not available year-round, so that they could be available. We've also taken the seeds out of blackberries now, the pits out of blackberries, and we want to do that in cherries. So that makes it so a fruit fits into your life more easily. And I think those are data is one thing. I think the real thing is to get things that really make an emotional difference for people.
Yes, and that we're interacting with in real life. Family, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think we don't eat technology, right? We eat food, and every technology we have is trying to solve a problem for us. Like the cell phone you have in your hands, highly technical, technology driven. So from a plant breeder's perspective, it's the same. We're trying to find a solution that addresses the concern you may have. So I'm a mom. I have little kids. I have to pack lunch. So one of my issues is I don't want my blueberries to be bruising because they're not going to eat it when I pack it. I don't want my apples to be brown when I cut it and put it in their lunchbox. But that is a very much, suburban mom problem, and that plant breeding can solve. When I was growing up in China, we were rationed. Our food was rationed. So that solution is completely different. It's about productivity, right? So from a plant breeder's perspective, it's about having the tools to address the problem that your customer wants, your grower wants. So is there a problem, salinity in their soil? So how do we use the data, all the tools to address that problem, right? I don't have a lot of land. I only have this much land. How do we address that by increasing our productivity? So I think when we talk about technology and we get stuck in that, for policymakers, for consumers, that is not really what we are buying. We're buying a solution. And from policymakers, they need to think about what is our domestic problem? Is it economic development? Is it farmer access to quality seeds? So that should drive their policy development, right? So I think when Peter mentioned that around the world, countries are really thinking about how they're addressing gene editing in agriculture, they are looking at this as how is this going to solve my problem, the problem that's facing my population, my country. And they're coming to that conclusion that this technology has a lot to offer in solving these issues that we have. And it's a very diverse group of countries, right? We have African countries, Southeast Asian countries coming to that same policy objective. And they're taking a much shorter time to make that policy decision than a lot of the countries where we don't have really dire food security issues, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point about the solution, because that's everything. That's also what drives capital. Show me the problem you're solving. And that can help on both those fronts. Peter, let's talk a little bit about the opportunity, right? We've been talking about the barriers that we have to overcome and some of the things that need improving. What's the opportunity that's out there? What are you most excited about when you see, and again, they laid out so many of the challenges, and we've been talking about them all week around the UNGA. What are some of the things that you're most excited about?
First of all, most gene editing scientists in agriculture are like kids in a candy store. I mean, there's so much opportunity. But I think what's at the forefront for us, particularly at Cibus, is helping farmers make every acre more productive, as I mentioned earlier. And so that's, for us, being able to do disease resistance, multiple diseases and multiple crops, understanding that you can address some of the challenges of controlling weeds in a farmer's field by herbicide tolerance. So we have a rice program that we're providing weed management systems for farmers. So there's a theme there you can hear. Crop protection is all about allowing the genetics to be the best they possibly can. And so when the farmer plants a crop, they have to control insects and weeds and disease, and that takes chemistry. And so I think one of the exciting parts for me is we can actually use the genetics that are available with some editing and replace that chemistry with biology. That is wonderful for the environment. It's also wonderful for the farmer, because the farmer doesn't have to spend as much money on inputs. And maybe not everyone understands that farming right now globally is really teetering on profitability. A lot of farmers are going out of business. And it's all to do with a lot of the input costs. Commodities go up and down, but it's a real struggle. And so you're getting larger, consolidation of farming areas around the world. And I think one of the things so the excitement for me, back to the excitement, is that's just the tip of the iceberg, because when you think about the opportunity crops and also what Tom is doing and their group in Pairwise, they're starting to look at food and providing really exciting characteristics of what we call traits within the seed business that is everything to including better flavour and nutrition. And so on a smaller footprint of farming land, you can improve not only the production but also the nutrition. And that's exciting for me.
And consumers have been voting with their feet. I mean, they want that variety, they want the access, and we know, especially, it's so acute to us because in the wake of COVID, we saw supply chains busted, and what happened as a result of that. Can that help lead change as well?
The consumer.
Yeah, the fact that they now want this, they sort of starting to see what's possible.
So again, maybe this ties back to who decides for the world, but reality is that often the consumers with deeper pockets are the ones who decide what the world gets to have, and I think certainly providing, and we're seeing a lot more products, whether they're from breeding or from technology, that are better flavored strawberries and things like this and you can see that consumers will vote with their wallets, and they'll buy those. I think one of the exciting things to tie back to Dr. Fowler's talk, though, when we start talking about these opportunity crops, most of them kind of still need domestication. So if you look at something like field corn in the United States, it's got billions of dollars being spent on developing varieties of that every year. And some of the grains that are grown in Africa have had really just the growers themselves are the breeders. There hasn't been any real investment in improving those. Gene editing is a tool that can really accelerate the domestication of those crops to make them so that they rather than having to be hand-picked, they could be picked with machines of some sort. So you could make the ability for production gains on those types of crops is much higher than the ability to gain production levels on corn. So what's a barrier to that, though, is if policy makes it so it's going to cost $50 million to go through a regulatory process to be able to grow that crop after you've done gene editing, then nobody in their right mind would invest in it.
The economics matter.
Nobody could invest in creating that product.
And when we're talking about resilience, we're also talking about the ability to be able to scale.
Exactly.
I mean, that's part of it.
But genetics is a very transferable thing, and it works at single holder level farms, and it works at people with 20,000 hectares of land.
And Fenley, I think that's something that many people will not be aware of. I think they tend to think of it as more large scale.
Right. I think the science is scale neutral, right? So a lot of the science that's occurring right now is applicable. So this is the opportunity in the excitement part, is that science can be a bottleneck because you have to develop tools to work with all these different species of crops, right? We're not just eating one thing. And that, there's so much opportunity there because that's happening. You can see this technology working in bananas, in grapes, in corn and soybean, but tomatoes and rice. So that is super exciting from a scientific perspective because that applicability to the neglected crops is there. So I'm very optimistic about the bottleneck of science, right? The bottleneck of policy is also optimistic, right? Because in the past, we say the one with the biggest wallet make the decision, and perhaps on the GMO, that was the countries with the least issue with food security made the decision about whether that was going to be more widely accessible globally. But on the policy front, we're not seeing that happening either. We're seeing countries like Argentina, Brazil, like Japan, like African countries making that determination that we are going to get ahead of Europe on our policy decision making. So I think that is also really a great opportunity because those two have to work together for something to actually to land in the hands of the farmers, right? So, but I think for us, it's the time is critical. As my plant breeder friend always says, the plants are planting in the ground right now. The plant breeder started that 7 years ago, right? So if you want to think about the plants we want to have for the next 4 or 5 years, we got to start now. Maybe now it's too late, right? For plant breeder to make that decision, it's both the science and the policy, whether they're going to start working on that. So that is where the urgency needs to be there to make things happen.
Can I add just something to that? Because that's a really important point. And Dr. Fowler's talked about that and the time. And I think one of the things that both Tom and I in our careers have seen how long it takes to get a product to market. And we don't have time. And that's the thing is that, we have the toolkits now and the plant breeding assets around the world. We have the infrastructure in some of the big companies, but the technology needs to have the ability to be, into the farmer's hands more quickly. And I think, when you think about plant breeding, they can do a lot of things, and it's really amazing what they can do, but it could take decades. Gene editing, what we're doing now at Cibus, we can do in 3 to 5 years, and that still may not be fast enough. So, but one of the things that we went through a pandemic. There's food pandemics as well when it comes to disease, and that's always a concern. And being able to react fast enough to, if there's a wheat disease that starts to go across Europe into North America, into other parts of the world, how quickly can you get genetic resources to the farmers to have resistance so you don't end up with complete crop failure? I mean, that's the reality. UG99, which was one many years ago, that happened. It was able to be stopped because of very clever plant breeders. But that's some of the risks. So I think the time factor here, we can't stress enough, I suppose.
And that's not something we think about. We had an entire conversation about pandemics in the health forum, but we don't think about it affecting crops because it's not our day-to-day business, and that's absolutely terrifying. And if we were talking about a pandemic hitting on the health front, we would be mobilized immediately, and we saw that in COVID. And it sounds like the same urgency is needed, especially given some of the numbers that Dr. Fowler said. Tom, let's get some closing thoughts from all of you. And what message would you like to leave, and what should policymakers prioritize?
Yeah, I think maybe to put all of it in perspective, I've been working in genetics and crops for all of my career, and the last 10 years or so really seeing the growth of how gene editing can impact the speed and all the other things that we're talking about. And we really are at a point now where it can make, I see a whole bunch of products in different pipelines around the world that are going to start showing up for people and start affecting food supply in positive ways. And this is we're not quite up over that hump of the hill to make sure that we're going to be just rolling down, but it's really important that we do when we look at all the problems that we have with getting people healthy diets and healthy food. So it's an exciting time. It's always an exciting time in plant genetics, but it's at a particularly exciting time now, and it'll be great to see what happens.
I think for me, it's this whole week of discussion is wonderful, but one of our director of our board says leadership is action, right? Leadership is not just talking. So I think that's why it was so important for us to be here this week at the UN. It's because all the leaders here, so we need to see action, right? Our plant breeders are acting. We're working on this. There's a gigantic pipeline. But is it going to be kind of stopped up at the policy level? We don't know. And I think that is a huge question right now for all of us. And so I think the last thought is, leadership is action. We got to have some action.
I love that. Close us out. And this is, it's a fantastic point to put on. I mean, so give us a final.
So I think, it is a call to action. I mean, I think there's no doubt, we can't underestimate what's been going on in the last couple of years. I think there's the activity around policies globally have recognised that there is an acceleration needed. There is policies that need to get into place, and a lot of countries around the world are there. But I think one of the things that's, in my mind, that's really important is that it's public understanding of genetics and what the opportunities are to resolve some of these problems and constraints in agriculture. And I think that's one thing that, I know we're constantly talking about in different forums, but that coincides with the policies being in place and allowing, seed companies to get it onto the market. We're only 2 or 3 years away from some of our products hitting the market in certain geographies. But we've also got a global footprint with regards to understanding that food is shipped around the world. Dr. Fowler talked about some of the challenges we have in that space right now. So getting the globe to understand the harmonising of policies is really important on the back of that. One last comment though, genetic resources, and I loved what he said, because it's an insurance policy to have all those genetic resources. Genetic potential is way higher than what we have on a farm. So, the corn that you grow in Iowa right now is fantastic yield, but you could double that yield just because the genetic potential is there. And so I think, having the toolkits to actually access that potential is going to really be so important for the rest of our lives anyway.
So it's so exciting when we're faced with these huge problems to know there are solutions, but the solutions are meaningless unless we can put them into effect.
Right.
And I think that this week, that's what everyone's really trying to focus on. Let's move from talk to actually implementing and doing that sort of hard work that's needed so that we can solve some of these problems. Thanks to all of you for educating us, I think, on a subject that needed some updating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please welcome Sana Beg, Deputy Under Secretary for Research, Education, and Economics at